before email, before cloud storage, before instant attachments. The world moved on paper. Contracts, medical records, government orders, court filings. If it mattered, it existed on a page. And if that page needed to travel, it didn't move by hand. It moved by machine. A document fed into a slot, a line connected, and somewhere else in the world, the same page emerged. Nearly identical, legally trusted, and immediate. For decades, this sound meant business could proceed, that governments could act, that hospitals could function, that deals could close. It wasn't fast by today's standards. It wasn't elegant. But, for a long time, this is how the world worked. This is the story of the fax machine. Before fax machines, information could travel quickly. Documents could not. If something needed to be approved, signed, or verified, it had to exist as a physical object. Paper was authority. A contract meant nothing until it arrived. A medical order meant nothing until it was seen. A legal filing meant nothing until it was received. And that movement took time. Documents were mailed, hand-carried by couriers, sent through internal mailrooms that moved at human speed. Within a city, delays were measured in hours, across countries, in days, across continents, in weeks. Every system built on paper accepted this as normal. Hospitals waited for charts. Law offices waited for filings. Governments waited for instructions. Businesses waited for confirmation. Not because decisions were complex, but because the documents simply were not there yet. The problem wasn't communication. People could talk, they could negotiate, they could agree. The problem was proof. Signatures, forms, records. The things that made an action legitimate could not move at the speed of a phone call. So entire institutions learned to live with delay. Workflows were built around waiting. Deadlines were padded. Urgency was negotiated against distance. Even when something was critical, it still had to travel. And until it arrived, nothing could proceed. The world was connected by voice, but it was governed by paper. Fax machines did not change how people spoke. They changed how documents moved. For the first time, a page could travel at the speed of a phone call. Not a summary, not a transcription, the page itself. A contract in one city could be reproduced in another. A medical order could arrive exactly as it was written. A legal filing could be transmitted without interpretation. What came out was not a message. It was the document. That distinction mattered. Because institutions did not run on conversation. They ran on proof. Fax machines didn't ask anyone to trust a description. They delivered the evidence. A signature appeared where a signature was required. A form arrived complete. A record could be archived immediately. Nothing had to be retyped. Nothing had to be translated. Nothing had to be re-explained. The document kept its authority. And suddenly, the longest part of every process disappeared. What once took days could happen in minutes. What once required physical transport could happen through a line. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but directly. Fax did not replace telephones. It replaced mailrooms. Couriers waiting. It collapsed distance without changing structure. Offices didn't need to be redesigned. Procedures didn't need to be rewritten. Institutions didn't have to rethink what a document was. They could keep everything the same, except the delay. That is why fax adoption was immediate. Not because it was modern, not because it was impressive, but because it fit perfectly into a world already governed by paper. It didn't challenge authority. It preserved it. And in doing so, it removed the one thing every paper-based system was built around: time. Once fax machines solved the problem, they stopped being remarkable. They became routine. They sat on desks, in mailrooms, in hospitals, in law offices, in government buildings. They were everywhere but rarely discussed. Fax numbers appeared on business cards, on letterhead, on official forms. Every organization assumed that if something mattered, it could be faxed, and because it worked, no one questioned it. Hospitals reorganized around it. Doctors no longer waited for charts to arrive by courier. Orders could be sent immediately. Records could be transmitted across buildings, across cities, across borders. In law, deadlines changed. Filings no longer depended on physical delivery. Documents could be sent at the last possible moment and still arrive in time. Courts accepted faxed copies as valid, because what mattered was the page itself. In government, instructions moved faster than ever before. Policies, approvals, directives, entire agencies adjusted to the assumption that a document could appear almost instantly. And in business, the fax machine became invisible infrastructure. Contracts moved between offices in minutes. Confirmations replaced waiting. International trade reorganized itself around the idea that paper no longer had to travel. What had once been the slowest part of every process, movement, was no longer an obstacle. The fax machine didn't demand attention. It didn't change how work was done. It didn't ask institutions to rethink what a document was. It simply removed the delay. And because it asked for nothing in return, it was trusted. Over time, dependence became absolute. Entire workflows assumed that a fax line existed on the other end. Deadlines were built around transmission. Compliance depended on it. Verification depended on it. When something was needed, it wasn't mailed. It was faxed. This wasn't innovation anymore. It was infrastructure. Outside the office, the fax machine shaped daily expectations. People no longer planned around delivery schedules. They planned around immediacy. A signature could be requested and received in the same hour. A correction could be sent without rewriting a process. Distance no longer implied delay. By the 1990s, the fax machine had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer a tool. It was part of how institutions thought. Paper was still authority, but now authority could move. And because that movement felt normal, it felt permanent. For a generation of organizations, there was no alternative. There was simply the assumption, if it matters, fax it. For a long time, nothing seemed capable of replacing the fax machine. Not because it was perfect, but because it was trusted. Early digital alternatives existed: email, scanners, file attachments. But they were unreliable, inconsistent, and often incompatible between systems. Files failed to open, formatting broke, images degraded, connections dropped. More importantly, digital documents did not yet carry authority. A printed page felt real. A faxed page felt official. But an email attachment felt provisional. Institutions did not run on convenience. They ran on proof. So the fax machine remained. It continued to hum in offices, hospitals, and agencies long after the first emails were sent. And then, gradually, something changed. Not through a single invention, not through a dramatic announcement, but through a series of small improvements that crossed an invisible threshold. Scanners became common, file formats stabilized, attachments became predictable, networks became reliable. And most importantly, the document itself changed. A PDF could preserve layout, signatures could be embedded, records could be stored without degradation, copies could be made without loss. For the first time, a digital file behaved like paper, not conceptually, functionally. The same properties that had once made fax indispensable, exactness, permanence, replicability, were now available without a machine, without a phone line, without physical output. Fax machines did not suddenly fail. They were simply matched, and then surpassed. Email did not replace the fax by being better at what fax did. It replaced it by redefining what a document was. A document no longer needed to exist on paper to be authoritative. It no longer needed to be printed to be real. It could exist as data. And once that shift occurred, the fax machine was no longer infrastructure. It was a workaround. At first, institutions didn't react. They continued using fax out of habit, out of compliance, out of comfort. But new systems were being built without it. Software assumed digital input. Databases expected files, not pages. Workflows were redesigned around storage, not transmission. The world didn't stop faxing. It simply stopped depending on it. And that difference would soon matter. The end of the fax machine did not arrive with an announcement. There was no final transmission, no last document. No moment anyone could point to and say, "This is when it ended," because systems like this do not fall. They are outgrown. As digital documents became the default, fax machines were used less. Then occasionally, then only when nothing else would work. Offices removed them without ceremony. Mailrooms shrank. Workflows were redesigned around storage, not transmission. What had once been essential simply stopped being required. And when something is no longer required by the system, it does not disappear. It becomes invisible. Yet the fax machine did not vanish everywhere. It remained in places where trust, compliance, and redundancy mattered more than efficiency. Hospitals, courts, government agencies. Not because fax was superior, but because it was independent. It did not rely on software updates. It did not require shared platforms. It did not break when systems failed. It printed what it received, and that simplicity still carried authority. In these environments, the fax machine became what it had always been, a tool of last certainty. But outside those institutions, the world had already moved on. The definition of a document had changed. Authority was no longer tied to paper. Legitimacy was no longer tied to ink. What mattered was the data itself. Stored, copied, verified, instantly available. The fax machine did not lose a battle, it lost relevance. Because once documents no longer needed to exist as physical objects, A machine designed to move paper had no role left to play. And that is the real story. Fax machines did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the world stopped needing what they were built to move. Not messages, not conversations. Paper. What replaced them was not faster technology. It was a new understanding of what a document is. From something you hold, to something you store. From something you transmit, to something that simply exists. The fax machine was never just a device. It was a bridge between a paper world and a digital one. And once that crossing was complete, the bridge was no longer required. That is how infrastructure ends. Not with noise, not with collapse, but when the world quietly learns to function without it.